Joining us now on the Megacast from Oakland University is Michael Greiner. He is an assistant professor of management at the Oakland University School of Business Administration. Back with us once again on today's program. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be back. Happy Friday, Tyler.
Yes, happy Friday to you as well. And there's been some big news this week, some high pressure news as well, particularly on the rails, as railway workers were negotiating new contracts in several unions across the U.S. And that had the potential. We've had a couple here in Michigan, as there's been a very brief sigh of relief with most of the negotiations being complete at this time, but that came really close to being a big economic issue here in the U.S. and therefore around the world.
It did. And this is probably the biggest story that most people aren't even going to be aware about, because basically they came to a deal about 2 a.m. In the morning where the contract was set to expire. So they came very close, and it basically required intervention by the White House. And in particular, the Secretary of Labor personally got involved in the negotiations, with President Biden even calling and directly talking to some of the parties to really pressure them to get something done. And so this is a huge story. Had the rails gone on strike, we would have essentially fallen into recession. There's no doubt about that. About a third of the cargo in our country is transported by rail. And you saw just a little bit of impact that we had as a result of the supply chain issues back during the COVID pandemic. And that was minor compared to the impact that we would have had as a result of a rail strike. And in fact, I believe the last rail strike was in 1992. And the impact was so bad that literally after 3 days, Congress stepped in and essentially imposed a contract on the parties because of the fact that the economy just couldn't sustain it. So the fact that they were able to come up with a negotiated settlement that both parties agreed to, I understand neither party is entirely happy with it, which is, a good sign, actually, when it comes to negotiations. Shows that we've really averted what could have been a real tragedy for our economy.
So these are kind of commonplace negotiations. Union contracts expire over the years, and they get renegotiated. And generally, we haven't heard much about these kinds of renegotiations, particularly as it pertains to the supply chain in past decades, if ever at all, in some cases. So why now? Why this time did it become such a hotly negotiated contract dispute between the unions and their bosses, as well as then intervention from the government?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And it really comes back to, once again, COVID, where we've got lower labor force participation. So as a result of that, you've got much higher demand for workers out there. And what happened as we went into COVID, of course, the railroads, like just about everybody else, laid off hundreds of thousands of workers, actually. And when they tried to call them back, then a certain percentage of them decided they did not want to come back to work. As a result of that, there's been, number one, incredibly high demand on the workers who did come back, where many of them haven't even been able to get days off to do things like go to the doctor, or when they've gotten sick with COVID, they haven't been able to get time off. And actually, there's been this situation where even when workers go and have to take time off to go to the doctor or because they're sick with COVID, it's ultimately led to them losing their jobs, if you can believe it. And then that leads to even more stress upon the workers who remain. So the biggest issue for the workers actually was the fact that they have been working so much and have been getting so little relief, and the railroads have really been pressuring them to work more because of the fact that they have fewer workers out there, that's caused all kinds of disruptions in the lives of the workers. At the same time, the railroads are kind of at a disadvantage now because of the fact that since there is this tightened labor market out there, they can't just go out and hire new people. So the workers in the union felt really empowered to go forward and kind of press their advantage right now because they knew that the railroads couldn't just turn around and essentially hire replacement workers to replace all the people who'd gone off on strike. So the union was feeling strong, while at the same time also feeling that they had some very serious grievances that needed to be addressed. As it turns out, actually, this contract expired back in 2019. But you're right about the fact that nothing happened until basically you had the confluence of these two things happening at the same time.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University School of Business Administration, where he serves as an assistant professor of management, joining us today on the Megacast. Again, you can find more information on all the programs at Oakland University at oakland.edu, oakland.edu for more information on that as well. And one more question on this particular issue, Michael, as it pertains to Michigan. I read an article from Bridge, Michigan this morning about this issue, about the end of these negotiations, that for Michigan, about 90 million tons of cargo are brought through the state on an annual basis by the railways. And so you mentioned earlier on, if this negotiation went awry and this contract wasn't reached in the wee hours of this Friday morning, that it would have certainly put the U.S. in almost immediately into a recession. But just how much of an immediate impact would a shutdown of our railways, or in some cases, or on a major scale like this, had economically, not only on Michigan, but the U.S. and the world?
Yeah, well, certainly Michigan would have felt the impact greatly because, of course, we're a manufacturing state. We rely upon the fact that we've got these parts that could come in and that the manufactured goods are able to get out of the state. And we saw again during COVID where, as a result of the shortage of semiconductors, some of the auto manufacturers had to actually shut down certain plants, and we saw huge disruption as a result of that. Well, that disruption again would have been minor compared to what we would have seen as a result of a rail strike, because again, this is an environment where manufacturers operate on a just-in-time inventory approach, where they wait for the day that they need a certain part before they have the part shipped to them. And the reason that they do that is, then they don't have warehousing costs and they're able to kind of offer more customized goods to their customers. So it's a good thing for everybody involved. The problem is, though, is if you have any disruption in that supply chain, all of a sudden the whole chain gets thrown off. And having the railroads not working would have been a huge disruption in that supply chain. And it reminds me of that old joke that they always tell that when the country gets a cold, Michigan gets pneumonia. And I think that's certainly what we would have seen had we seen a railroad strike this time.
Yeah, certainly have seen some major economic impacts of past crises right here in Michigan at an inflated rate from other areas across the U.S. We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University, assistant professor of management in their School of Business Administration, on today's edition of the Megacast. More interesting things happening economically. We've seen some numbers come out recently that in a report from the New York Times, that pandemic aid over the last couple of years has significantly impacted the childhood poverty rate, and it's at its lowest since the 90s. Just how much of an impact did that have on the child poverty rate, and how do you believe that might impact the way that a further government aid may be brought down the line, particularly from the Biden administration in his 2 remaining years in office before the next election?
Yeah, this is actually kind of an exciting story. And it's one more example of where, because we're always focused on the bad news, sometimes we miss the good news stories. And really, what we've seen is starting in the 1990s, when there was the welfare reform package that was passed during the Clinton administration, there's been this steady decline in child poverty. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was essentially a deal made when they passed that legislation. The deal was that, hey, we're going to require these people to work to be able to get some of these benefits, but on the other hand, when they do work, we're going to give more generous benefits. Well, as it turns out, the many of the single mothers who essentially were kind of pushed back into the workforce as a result of this legislation have found that they're able to work relatively easily compared to what the expectations were at the time that the legislation passed. At the same time, they've benefited from more generous, what they used to call food stamps, but now are called SNAPs. I think it's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And there are some other programs that have also been very helpful. And as a result of that, there's been this steady decline in childhood poverty, which has been remarkable, really, since the mid 1990s. Now, that accelerated then as a result of the pandemic aid that was passed last year, when there was the expansion of the child's tax credit. And many parents might remember where there was this $300 a month that was being sent directly to their bank accounts every month. And that lasted for about a year. And as it turns out, that had a dramatic impact on childhood poverty, essentially pushing that off a cliff. And childhood poverty, for the first time, really since it's been recorded, has dropped to about 5.2% of total children, which is really a remarkable accomplishment. Now, of course, that tax credit expired. So the question is that going to bounce back? My guess is probably yes. But you raise a great point, which is that now, as a result of this data, I think you're going to expect to see increased pressure to bring back that child tax credit. And in fact, there's talk right now where there's some pressure to address some of the problems that were essentially created when the tax cuts were passed during the last administration. And the response of many of the Democrats now in Congress are saying, hey, if we're going to address these issues that exist with the legislation that was passed during the last administration, we're going to have to see this child tax credit come back. And there's now this data really provides a lot of support for that kind of approach. And so I would not be surprised if we see it coming back, at least in some form, in the relative near future.
Yeah, one of the interesting questions that I had back when all this aid was initially being put into place was how do you maintain some of these programs after the pandemic is past us, or after these economic issues related to the pandemic are kind of in the rearview mirror? Because if you're giving this sort of an economic bump to families that are facing poverty and that lifts them out of it, maybe that's enough of a catapult to keep some of those families, a small percentage of them, from going back into poverty. But once that money is gone, that could be you could have just a recurring issue there. And then what's it really for? So it's nice to see that aid is having a nice impact. And it's good to hear too that that's being something that's received on both sides as really being something that could stick around for a while.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. I mean, one thing that's been shown repeatedly is that when children are kind of brought out of poverty, their long-term their long-term earnings, their contribution to the economy is much more significant. They have much better outcomes. So in the long run, it's probably a win-win for the economy. But you're right, in the short run, it requires some budget balancing, no doubt about it.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University on today's edition of the Megacast. He is an assistant professor of management in their School of Business Administration. You can learn more information about programs through their School of Business Administration by visiting oakland.edu for more information on all that. In terms of inflation, between the U.S. railroads being on the verge of a big strike, between all the other economic issues and some uncertainty on Wall Street, inflation continues to be at annoyingly large highs for so many people. It remained stubbornly high in August, and consumers and investors alike have had pretty common reactions to those, being a little more careful with their money. How much of an impact are these other issues, such as the railroad negotiations and continued issues overseas, really having on what the government and what business and industry can do to prevent further exacerbation of this issue right here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a crazy week for inflation statistics. The irony is on Monday we got some good news where there's a survey that looks at the expectations that people have for inflation, and those actually went down pretty substantially. And again, we've talked about this before, but you can't underestimate the importance of psychology to economics. If people are expecting that there's going to be higher inflation, then they're going to demand higher wages. And that then is going to translate to more inflation. So it becomes that old wage price spiral. And that's something that they really want to avoid. So the fact that that went down on Monday, everybody is saying, oh, that's good news. And I think that there's been this sense among a lot of investors that, hey, we're starting to see some impact on inflation. Things seem to be heading in the right direction. Then on Wednesday, we got a report that was really kind of devastating. While it did show that, yes, gas prices have continued to go down. And as a result, what's called the consumer price index has it basically went down just a hair. What's really of concern is what's called the core inflation, and that looks at things excluding things like energy prices and food, which tend to be more volatile. And there we actually saw a pretty big uptick, and that tends to be the type of thing that the Federal Reserve looks at more closely when they're trying to determine if they're doing the job that they need to with inflation. And I think it's fair to say that based upon the report that we received here, you're going to see the Fed continuing to move aggressively to try to tame inflation. They have another meeting next week. I expect that we're going to see another 0.75% increase in the interest rates, which will continue to drive up interest rates. And as we talked about last time, the Fed chair was quite explicit about the fact that they're going to keep working on this until they get the job done. This report clearly showed the job is not done. But then yesterday, we get a report showing that, the producer price index, which shows how much producers are charging for things, has gone down a little bit. And that's kind of what we call a leading indicator, which means that the effects of that aren't quite felt yet, because those price reductions get passed on to consumers down the road. So my guess is people are going to start to be feeling a little more positive about things. But I think until we start to see some calming down of inflation at the consumer price index level, you're really going to see the Fed continuing with their aggressive effort to try to tame inflation.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University. On today's edition of the Megacast, you can find more information on their School of Business Administration programs and other programs at Oakland by visiting oakland.edu for all that information. Oakland.edu for more info. Michael, what sort of forecasts are there for a timeline on these inflation issues? When could we see some improvement, at least from where the projections are from experts and economists at this point in time?
You see, that's the hard thing, Tyler, and you've really put your finger on it, which is that it's really hard to estimate these things. I mean, number one, there are so many things that are out of our control that are impacting it. Of course, we've got the war in Ukraine that continues to have impacts on it. That's what really caused the big jump up in oil prices that we saw early on. And it's also part of what's impacting right now the price of electricity and natural gas. And part of the reason that electricity has gone up is because we generate so much electricity with natural gas. But there are other things that are impacted as well. We see the supply chain issues kind of calming down. And as we talked about earlier, had there been this rail strike, that would have gone berserk. And we would have seen a whole new issue arise there, which certainly would have directly impacted inflation. But that's been calming down. So that's where everybody was starting to feel, maybe we're going to get some good news here. But I think part of that is driven by what we call motivated reasoning, where people would like inflation to go down. I think all of us want to see it go down. So, we're more likely to kind of emphasize indications that seem to indicate that, maybe things are getting better, rather than looking at things that say, we've still got a ways to go on this. And the one thing that still seems to indicate that we've got a ways to go on this is the fact that the economy remains hot. And the best indicator of that is the job market. And the job market remains hot. We just received last week another report showing that we had really aggressive hiring. The labor force participation ticked up a little bit, but overall, that's down still. And my guess is that's going to remain down, which means that we're going to continue to have a tight labor market. And that's going to mean that again, as we talked about with like the rail strike, that there's going to be the employees are going to be in a position where they can demand higher wages and better working conditions. And that then is going to create more pressure on inflation as well. So until we start to see some slowing down of the economy, really, particularly as indicated by the labor force figures, my guess is that we're really not going to see some progress on inflation. And at this point, we really don't have any indication that that's starting to slow down. So my guess is it's going to be at least a few more months before we start to see inflation really starting to come down in any kind of meaningful way.
We're joined by Michael Greiner on today's edition of the Megacast from Oakland University. And yeah, that's going to be the big concern for people going forward is when can we start to see this improvement? And it's going to be tough to gauge that with the continued fluctuations across the economy. They're not really moving in unison. And so I would imagine that makes it really hard for economists in particular, but also those in the government, especially at the Fed, that have the biggest sway in the impact of inflation in our communities can have on forecasting where this goes.
You're absolutely right, and I think we saw an indication of that with the reaction of the markets to the announcement regarding the higher inflation figures. And what that was is I think that the investors, what they were saying is, we're going to start to see some reduction in inflation, and that should indicate that the Fed will start slowing down on their rate increases. When we got the pretty negative report there, all of a sudden you saw a crash in the stock market. Well, people get all upset about that. And, as we've talked about before, I think that that concern is a little bit overstated because it really indicates more investors shifting their investments from stocks to bonds, which bonds obviously do better when inflation rates are higher because they get interest on them. But it shows that here you had these professional investors, Wall Street, essentially looking at what they expected, and they were shocked with what actually ended up being reported when the government reported the statistics. So it just shows how difficult this is to try to estimate. Because believe me, if Wall Street thought that they knew what was coming, they would have bet that way with their dollars. And the fact that they completely misread it just shows how difficult it is to kind of try to estimate this.
And it's going to continue to be difficult. There's going to be more news that comes in the coming days, weeks, and months that will certainly have an impact on that. And for all that information, we'll come back right here to talk with you, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot, Tyler. Have a great weekend.